Come meow into the mic if you're gonna meow. Come here. Oh, he's coming up. I doubt you can see him at all. Maybe his tail. Yeah, say more? Yeah. I'm here to talk to you about Rejection by Tony Tulatamudi. This book was on the required fall reading list. It is a collection of short stories, and it's fucking crazy. I'm only 3 stories in. I think I'm just going to tell you about the first story. Maybe I'll also tell you about the second story right now. I kind of just want to update and talk about this book as I go along. I'm reading it very slowly because this is a book that you need to read slowly. It is supremely uncomfortable in the best way, but also in the worst way. I can't have too much of this at once. Partly because of how uncomfortable it is, and also partly because of how luxuriously delicious it is. This is decadent writing. I'm only 3 stories in, and I already know that this is one of the best reads of the year. It could do anything in the last half, and I would still think that it was one of the most incredible pieces of fiction that I had ever read. So exactly my taste, so exactly up my alley. I am loving it. Let me tell you about the first story. It is so far the worst story, but in terms of discomfort and horror, but also maybe the platonic ideal of a short story. It is such a strong start to a collection. Holy shit. I cannot recommend reading this story enough. If you're going to read one story, I think you should read this one. Though my mind might change once I get to the 4th story, which I know is structured as an Am I the Asshole post, which you're like, that could go so wrong. And I just have a feeling that Tulatamudi is going to be able to do it justice, but I'm not there yet. Okay, first story. The first story is called The Feminist, and it follows this man whose entire life revolves around getting laid and failing to get laid. In the beginning, he is involuntarily celibate, and that takes up his entire life and is all-consuming to him, but he has not yet quite fallen for the incel rhetoric. Instead, he's kind of gone in the other direction. He has this ever-present entitlement because he considers himself to be a feminist. And this is something that he weaponizes. He has knowledge about feminist issues, but no level of understanding of them. And while on the surface, he can acknowledge his privilege and does acknowledge his privilege for the sole purpose of getting women to sleep with him and failing again and again because it's so obvious what he's doing. He can acknowledge that surface level, but really in his mind, he is always the victim and he's always able to make himself the victim. This is an unreliable narrator and it's told in 3rd person, and that works so well for this story because you're not in his head, so you don't become absolutely sick of him right from the jump. You can have a little bit more empathy, though you do hate him and you know that he's awful. You can have a bit more empathy for him as this misguided man who has alienated himself. With his insane valuing of romantic relationships that he has no access to because of the way that he has valued them and put so much significance on them and treated romance as the only important thing, basing everything off of it, that in itself is incredibly off-putting and blocks his access to the romance that he so desperately wants. He does become a lot scarier and more radicalized as the story goes on. So it begins with him in college with many female friends who he is unable to stop himself from asking out. But he is well versed in this very self-serving feminist language where he can and will say things like, I'm not just friends with women so that I can have a chance with them, but that's not true. And even scarier, he doesn't know that that's not true. A friend softly rejects him and he pretends that he's okay, but he can't let it go. He emails her that night. She doesn't respond. He emails her again, asking for a response, and she doesn't respond. He emails her more and more times, getting increasingly desperate, now being like, why is it that you rejected me? Not that I have any problems with it, but what is it about me specifically? What's the reason that you said no to me? This happens 4 or 5 more times during his college days, and he never learns. Women are never people to him. They are always potential mates, and he never recognizes that. Throughout all of his self-pitying ramblings about how he can't land a girlfriend, which more and more frequently are pinned on women as a species, there's this refrain that's this comic relief where he blames his narrow shoulders, this uncontrollable biological disadvantage that he has that must be the cause of his issues, must be the reason why women are always rejecting him. He is unable to see himself ever as being in the wrong about anything. He can say he's a feminist all he wants, he can use the language, he can read Judith Butler, but any privilege of his own that he acknowledges, he pins on men generally, and he sees himself kind of secretly as better than men generally because he is a feminist. Friend-zoned by everyone in his life, he turns to online dating. And let me read you his profile. He, him, his, or whatever pronouns you are most comfortable with. Unshakably serious about consent. Abortion's #1 fan. Loves books, Thai food, a glass of vino verde on my balcony, endless conversation. And did I mention books? Tongue out emoji. I can usually be found haunting the bookstores and bake shops of our fair burg when I'm not dismantling the imperialist, male supremacist heteropatriarchy. But I'd also be fine saying, to hell with it, and staying at home for an Agnes Varda marathon sesh followed by discussion, ... And perhaps a wee snog fest? Wink emoji. I always do my own cooking. Thanks, Mom. So I'll make a killer brunch for you. Trans women are women. Duh. All races, ethnicities, and body types, but not all ages. Very welcome. Mutual GGG. Perfect example of who he is. How fucking sinister is that? He is saying all the right words just to say all the right words, and together all of the right words become wrong. He ends up finding a woman that he rejected when they went to middle school together. She's the only woman who's ever really expressed interest in him, and he wasn't into her because of her curvaceous body type, I think is exactly the words that he uses. Now she's lost some weight, so they go on a date together. And at this date, she's obviously really unwell. She starts talking about everything going on in her life. And then at the end of the date, he's like, can we kiss? And she's like, no. And he says, why? And she says, what do you mean, why? Because I don't want to. And he says, well, why don't you want to? And she pushes him and he falls to the ground and she says, oh my God, are you wearing shoulder pads? That genuinely got like a full belly laugh from me. That's incredible. It was so fucking funny. Despite everything that happens on this date, they do end up going home together and he loses his virginity to her. And it's not good because it'll never be good enough. The goalpost is always being pushed by this guy. A few years later, in his 30s, he is rightfully called out and like totally dressed down by one of his friends and then called out online, and it does not get through to him. He is the victim. He needs to be the victim, and it very clearly shows his leaps of logic and the justifications that he uses to get himself into the role of victimhood in his own head, and it's frightening. During this time, he ends up messing his own dick up because he's like pumping it to make it bigger and also addicted to masturbating, and he kind of retreats into himself. He doesn't really ever see anyone. He spends all of his time in his apartment. One day he decides to go to his old favorite restaurant, and as he's entering, there's a whole bunch of women leaving and they all have strollers, which is basically the most offensive thing that this man could possibly see. And this woman is trying to come out and he won't let her. He won't be polite. He's like standing up for himself, and she pushes an inner door open onto his toe and it like peels back his toenail. And the guy who's with her is like, dude, she can't leave if you don't move, because you do let people out first. Like, sure, maybe she shouldn't have like ripped his toenail off of his foot, but she was kind of in the right. He then chases these women down the block after they've left, and he pushes one of the strollers almost all the way over with a newborn baby in it, and then he runs away. Years pass of his loneliness and his isolation, and the radicalization really starts taking hold, especially when he is diagnosed with what I think my guess is prostate cancer, something wrong down there. He finds a narrow shoulders community, and all of a sudden, this hilarious little thing is no longer funny at all. He becomes certain, convinced through this community, that narrow-shouldered men are the most oppressed group in all of society. It's like typical incel rhetoric where they feel like they don't have the camaraderie of being a woman, but they also don't have the privilege of being a man because they don't fit into like the narrow confines of masculinity. You know, they've like understood some things about gender and then taken it in the complete wrong direction. He hasn't like totally assimilated into this group of incels. He does still see himself as a little bit different, a little bit above them, because he's still clinging on to his identity as a feminist. It ends with this almost manifesto-like post on the forum where he's responding to a comment of a guy who reminds him of himself when he was like in college and still naive about being narrow-shouldered. And you can see in this manifesto this skewed combination of the feminist language that he was using before and the incel rhetoric together. And it's both nonsense and terrifyingly coherent. It's a man who has come to all of the wrong conclusions. In the very last lines, he returns to that restaurant where he holds the door open for a young woman who smiles at him. This is the first time that he's made eye contact with a woman in literally years. He smiles back, and then he pulls the ski mask down over his face, and he slips his backpack off of his narrow shoulders before heading into the restaurant. And it is truly the best and worst ending of a short story that I have ever encountered in the entirety of my life. And I used to read so many short stories. Holy fucking shit. To turn the narrow-shouldered thing from comic relief to frightening to literally like jaw-dropping, gut-punching at the end here, to bring it all back. Oh my God. Oh my God. And then like to have the implied violence without actually having to show the violence, feeling like you have to show the violence, but then at the same time, kind of showing the violence in his thought patterns throughout the full 30 pages of the story. Wow. Like, wow. It is incredible. It's so fucking good. It's the strongest start to a book I have ever read. It's a very good example of a spiral of radicalization. It's a very familiar type of man, and it shows the worst thing that he can become. And that familiarity is what is so scary about this story and about being inside but not quite inside his head. Because like I said, it's in third person, and the third person is so perfect. I need you to go read this. I can't describe to you how well that perspective works for this story, but it just does. Everything is always posed as a question. Whenever he's saying something that he knows is not quite feminist, the narrative is posing it as a question. He'll never make a definitive statement. It's this perfect feigned innocence. It's like, well, sure, if this feminist thing is true, but doesn't that mean that I'm actually oppressed? Over and over again. And having it in third person almost gives more credibility to what he's saying, because it isn't necessarily his voice, though it is at the same time his voice. I just need you to read it. It's just so good. All of the choices made are so perfect in this story, and I think it works as a standalone. This is obviously very well thought out. This story knows this character, and it knows how to communicate him to you while still building this narrative that's mostly done through the evolution of his rhetoric and not necessarily through events that happen in the story. It's exactly what a short story should be. It's effective, it's efficient, it's punchy, it's 30 pages that I will literally never forget. This one story has impacted me more than like 80% of the books that I've read in my life. That's insanity. I read this story like 2 weeks ago, and I am still thinking about it almost every single day. I will come and talk to you about the second story the next time that I feel like filming, but we're having friends over to play board games tonight, so I have to go kind of like clean our disgusting messy house. So I'm going to do that, and I'll see you at one point. Goodbye. All right, I finished the second story in Rejection. I'm here to talk about it. Not quite as crazy as the first one, but just as interesting. This story follows Allison, someone who hasn't necessarily struggled with landing dates, but has never been in love, and she feels more and more like a failure for that the older that she gets. Opposed to the first story, Allison focuses this more internally. She thinks that it must be something innately wrong with her, that all of the attention that she gets is negative or casual. She believes that she needs to change. Being in love is this abstracted, idealized value for Allison. It's not necessarily a full-fledged obsession, but it's certainly something that she thinks about a lot in her life. She also seems to have some arrested development in other areas of her life, like her career and her friend group. Those are definitely contributing to her feelings of failure, but they go unacknowledged. She puts all of her disappointment in herself into the idea that she is unlovable and needs to make herself lovable. One night, Allison goes for a monthly dinner that she has with her close friend from university, Neil. Neil is the one and only person on the planet who actually helped Allison through her eating disorder in university without overly pitying her or being disgusted by her or treating her like she was impossibly delicate or looking down on her. They typically get together so that she can cut his hair and they can watch some random TV show together. Neil is, by Allison's own admission, a pretty interesting person. He builds his own furniture from reclaimed wood, he financially supports his parents, he has plants and he has books, and I think he plays the guitar, and he also works for a nonprofit that rehabilitates pedophiles that are going through voluntary chemical castration. Despite recognizing him as kind and intelligent and fascinating, Allison says that they are strictly just friends, and she has never felt any attraction towards Neil. That is, until he makes a slightly awkward, provocative joke, and he puts his hand on her knee, and she realizes that he is attracted to her. and then she is absolutely head over heels all over him. They have sex, and midway through oral, he asks her if he can take a photo of her while she's going down on him, and she gives him permission. And he sends it to her after, and it isn't a flattering photo of her, because how could it be? But it's also proof of this experience, which will never happen again. She wakes up early the next morning to poach him some eggs, which, if you have read Boy Parts by Eliza Clark, it's that. Something so deeply and inappropriately intimate about this extra effort and care that it takes to poach eggs as opposed to any other way of preparing them the morning after your first, I think it was the first sexual encounter in Boy Parts as well. Oh my God, is it awkward? Especially when those feelings are not reciprocated. Which he gets up and he's like, listen, I don't want you to get the wrong idea. That was fun. I don't regret it. I like you. Mostly as a friend, though. I'm not looking for anything serious right now. And she thinks, that's okay. I can stomach the long game. I can deal with this, and we will end up together. As soon as she leaves his house, she reads up on her group chat so that she can report this to them. This group chat is made of women who she interned with at a women's magazine years ago. They are all quite notably younger than her. They've rarely seen each other since they left their old shared job, but they do text in this group chat every single day, mostly about various negative experiences with men and dating. The first texts that we see here are from them talking about recent dates where like one of their dates pointed at a rainbow flag and said, I don't know, it just kind of weirds me out. And then another woman is like, on the topic of pointing, I went on a date with a guy and he asked me how big my boobs were and then just kind of like pointed at them. They're all joking around and they're speaking to each other in a very similar way while still maintaining pretty distinct voices for each of them. It impressively captures the essence of a group chat of friends poking fun and trying to make each other laugh and feeding off of each other and like matching everyone else's tone and playfulness and vulgarity. It's all very reciprocal. And then Allison comes in. Allison is so obviously an older millennial in this group chat who does not adjust herself to fit in at all. Like, perfect grammar. She is texting with caps and periods and everything. And she also very clearly doesn't really care about anyone else's shit. She comes in and she kind of like vaguely goes, that's hilarious, guys, just to give herself a segue into talking about hooking up with Neil. And the other women in the group chat, to their credit, do try to include Allison without sacrificing their own way of speaking and engaging with each other. They don't change into this formal register that Allison speaks in to make her fit in better, which would come across as false. But this also comes across as a little bit false, especially as you get further into the story. Don't let me get ahead of myself. So Allison is like excitedly relaying this budding relationship to the girls and trying to play it cool with Neil, not bringing anything up directly with him, but over the next few weeks, doing things like scrolling to his first ever Instagram post and commenting just a question mark, or sending him an at night ambiguously nude photo of like her collarbones and her smirking lips with what you doing underneath. And then he responds with something straightforward like, I'm just getting around to starting True Detective season 1. He is sending her no signals that he is ready or willing for this to continue. And she is going back on birth control anyway. At their next highly anticipated from Allison's end monthly dinner, she is trying to touch him and to send him the message that she wants to take this further again, as much as she can, and it is stomach-turningly awkward. Like it says, she manages to get in a hair ruffle and a squeeze of the arm during dinner, as if to do these things, she has to fight his body language and what he is trying to wordlessly express to her. Her expectations are so high, and they have blown themselves even further out of proportion in the last month of anticipating this, where she hasn't really talked about any of it, especially not to him, so it's been left alone to fester in her very obsessive mind. So when it finally happens, when she is finally direct and clear about what she wants, it is an astronomical blow to her self-esteem and her understanding of the world and her relationships when he puts physical distance between them and tells her that he doesn't think that it's a good idea. And while he cares about her a lot and thinks that she's great, it's nothing to do with her. He's not in the right place for a relationship right now. And then he says, because emotions are high, we should probably have a cool down period. Starting right now. Does she want to take the leftovers home? She is booted from his apartment. Allison gets in the Uber, and the narrative transitions seamlessly into the group chat texts, where she has just finished giving this update to her friends, all of whom turn on Neil and call him weird and not even that hot and suspicious for his line of work. And while it is supportive, Allison figures that it also must be untruthful somewhere along the way, either in their original hyping up of him or their now very strong current condemnation. For the next few months, Allison tries not to think about Neil, but she is absolutely obsessing, turning everything over in her mind constantly. Her stewing becomes vicious. She feels wronged at how Neil has managed to come out on top, and she just has to wait for him to reach out, no matter how much she might need him, or else she will risk looking desperate and once again embarrass herself by wanting more than the other side and then being denied it. And then he does reach out. He extends the modern day olive branch of once again starting to like her Instagram posts. They meet up for coffee and no one knows how to act. It's awkward and overly polite and formal, and they very carefully step around talking about their friendship or what happened between them. But now the first meeting in the after of this chasm being torn between the two of them has now been completed, and they can start to move on by doing something a little bit more serious, meeting for dinner, where without warning, he shows up with another woman. Allison is very, extraordinarily caught up on how small, beautiful, and Asian this woman Cece is. In Allison's eyes, Cece is perfectly curated to appeal to men in a way that Allison cannot naturally imitate no matter how hard she tries. So to push down her feelings about seeing Neil with this woman who he adamantly claims is not his girlfriend, though that doesn't really change anything for Allison, the issue is seeing him with any other woman who she can compare herself to and feel worse than, and also to push down her far more reasonable and justified irritation about him randomly showing up to a planned dinner between friends with a stranger. She orders round after round to their table. And even when Neil and Cece insist that they won't drink the next round, Allison orders it anyway. And she pushes and pushes for them to drink it, and when they won't, she just drinks all three. Of course, she gets very, very sloppy, and she decides to bring up how her and Neil once hooked up just to get it all out in the open so that Cece can know that they did it, but that it's over with now. And she goes into extreme graphic detail about their one sexual encounter. And then she says, out loud to them, it makes sense he'd date a Filipina girl because he likes them dusky, but his parents would disown him if he ever dated anyone black or Latina. So they leave after Neil tells her that he knew that she wouldn't be able to be chill. She wakes up the next morning blindingly hungover. I think Tula Tamudi says she's so hungover that she has to sit on the rim of the bathtub when she brushes her teeth that morning. She also wakes up to a long email from Neil talking about how Allison loves to put herself in miserable situations that justify her sadness, and no matter what, she's able to make herself into the victim. And also, it's so random that she decided that Cece is Filipina because she's literally Korean. Essentially, this email is Neil saying that she has to get herself under control or their friendship will not be able to continue. And there's a really good example of Allison's thought process here where she's trying to come up with a way to respond to this email. It says, so she went too far. Fine. All she cares about is how she can make him own his share of the blame. Confront him with her grievances? No, that'd look petulant and reactive. Could she respond with a simple lol? Being glib would give him an excuse to sever their friendship with equally low effort, and he'd probably feel more relief than guilt. Ignore him? Wounded, weak, mind-gamey, plus her absence would be punitive only if he cared about her. Retaliation is impossible when he's doing so well. All she can do is scrabble around in ineffectual rage like a cat chasing a laser. She ends up deciding that the most tactical move is to apologize wholeheartedly, to take responsibility and essentially get on her hands and knees to preserve their friendship. And he responds with a very simple and curt, all right, we're good, thumbs up emoji, which sours everything. Any remaining affection that she had for Neil turns on its head into anger towards him, but the obsession is not diminished at all. It only continues to grow. What I really love about this situation, and it's something that keeps happening as the story goes on, is that Allison isn't always completely black and white in the wrong. Like here, she is fully justified in being upset at Neil bringing this rando along with him to the dinner without checking with her first, even if he was doing it in full innocent ignorance, which he was not. Neil was absolutely testing her. He was trying to put her in a high-stress, socially awkward situation so that she would either be put where he thinks her rightful place is as a friend and nothing else, or so that she could do what he expected her to do and said he expected her to do, which is act out, and then he could legitimize his decision to cut her out of his life, almost forcing his own hand, but making it out to be all Allison's fault. But because the way that Allison reacts to real and perceived slights is so totally out of hand, she does, in her reactions, become wrong. She puts herself in the role of the one in the wrong because she's so emotionally unregulated. It is a fascinating dynamic between the two of them. The book at this point is showing you morally gray situations through characters that have really black and white thinking, and it's doing a great job of asking you to really consider how you understand these situations. We once again transition seamlessly from the narrative to the group chat, where Allison is sending a wall of high emotion, rambling texts into a chat that, as we've seen, is mostly people who aren't that close or intimate with each other, using this to like joke around and lightheartedly complain about men. She, however, is sending perfectly grammared text messages about how frustrated and angry and fucked over she feels. And the first response that she gets back is, "Oh, hun, that's awful. Let's take a breath and get centered," which I hate almost as much as I hate what Allison is doing. So incredibly patronizing, so belittling of how she's feeling, such annoying therapy speak. Oh my God, it pisses me off so much. But then at the same time, like, how in the world do you respond to this kind of behavior from Allison? They're doing the best that they can. Let's take a breath and get centered. And with, it's just an N. Oh my God. I don't know why I hate it so much. I need to reflect on that. Allison plows right through it to start talking about Neil's audacity to parade his new hairless Asian child bride in front of her, which grinds everything to a halt in this group of, it seems to be mostly women of color, who are not afraid to call her out for slipping in that racist comment. She kind of backtracks, and no one really wants to push it or even really like touch this whole situation with Allison. She is very obviously extremely agitated and jumpy, so they sort of try redirecting the conversation into talking about meditation and therapy and assigning a specific time of day to just let yourself wallow, but not obsessing constantly. And once again, she plows right through this to keep on venting into what she's treating as an empty void, but are real people receiving these messages. She goes on a rant about how therapy doesn't work for her and how she went through 6 different therapists and all they ever did was give her problems new names, which just made things easier to obsess over. They again try to redirect and lighten the mood by talking about the antidepressants that they're on, and she says something about how she's already boring. Why would she need antidepressants? Even through the layers of separation of the text format and then reading it written out like a log like this, you can feel the heavy, awkward silence. Especially because she then gets hit with the most non-confrontational, but confrontational if you decide to take it that way, single question mark in a text message. We have all employed the single question mark when someone is being weird as fuck and you're letting them decide how big of a thing this is going to be and what the tone is by giving them nothing but the obligation to explain themselves. Once again, she backtracks. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry. I wasn't meaning to say that you guys are boring because you're on medication. I'm just ribbing myself." Again, they let this slide. Again, they start talking about other possible solutions. Again, lighthearted. Again, this isn't their place or their job. She has been given 2 chances now, 2 opportunities to step back and take a look at herself and how her very high emotions are impacting her ability to effectively and considerately communicate. But no. Allison isn't silent while they're talking about sad lamps because she's reflecting. It's because she's typing. She just jumps right in again as though no other conversation has happened, because this isn't even her sounding board. It is just a place where she can talk about her problems. Honestly, truly, so hard to read. Especially when, once again, she makes an extremely weird racist comment about Cece's ethnicity, which they generously mostly let slide, and then you flip to the next page and you take a massive breath of fresh air when you realize that we are back to the narrative and out of the group chat. The horrifically realistic disaster of a group chat where some of the members are ready for the obviously clearly ensuing conflict, and then others are trying to deflect, and then there's Allison who's unable to pick up on anything outside of her own emotional turmoil, and she's letting all of her worst qualities and opinions shine through. In the narrative, Allison cuts Neil out of her life, but he doesn't even seem to notice, and if he does notice, he certainly doesn't care. She's not looking for a relationship, but she does get herself on the apps to try and fill the void that Neil has left in her life. And who does she meet but the fucking feminist? Allison is the woman that he went on a kind of disastrous date with and then lost his virginity to. And now we see that same date from her perspective. all of his terrible quirks, but from a woman's point of view. Even just as simple as his desire for her to agree with everything that he says, saying things that she does agree with, but his desperation and excitement to get her approval on them pisses him off is so interesting. And it is just scraping the surface of this guy. It seems to her like he's only really engaged with her when she's talking about her misery, which of course one drink in, she's giving him the whole rundown on Neil and her eating disorder. He steers the conversation back to this over and over again so that he can demonstrate his ability to perform caring. I will always love seeing a conversation from two sides, especially when those two sides are so very internal. I'm Looking at You, Normal People by Sally Rooney. That's the best part of the book. I love looking at what these people are too blind to see about themselves, even if they're so obvious to others. I love seeing how they each build their respective narratives, the different levels of significance certain moments or the entire interaction generally has for each person, impact and intent, and all the rest. It is so very interesting to me, and I will always eat it right up. And I also love when the interconnected stories interconnect. This date is way less important in Allison's story than it is in his, but her going home with him does show her absolutely tanking self-esteem. Months pass of dread and loneliness and anger and self-loathing, all of which is only abated by hating Neil with every fiber of her being, focusing all her energy into that. And she fuels this by poring over his social media, where he is, of course, in a relationship with Cece. Allison spirals further. She wants to compete with Cece by being cool and aloof online, but the selfies that she puts all this effort into looking effortless turn out awkward and uncomfortable and poorly framed, so she decides instead that she needs a thing. Selfies on Instagram won't cut it. She needs to prove that she's better than Cece and other women by getting a thing that sets herself apart from everyone else. And she decides that thing is a raven. So she buys a giant fucking raven, way too big for her tiny apartment. And also the raven hates her. It's not like this cool, mysterious hobby. It's a massive bird who doesn't even like her, takes over her entire life, and is so incredibly loud and also violent towards her. She continues obsessing and obsessing over Neil, which you'd think would get boring, but it didn't. At least not for me. She's poking at this like a sore tooth. She's turning it over. She's finding every side of it. She's always looking at things differently, but with the same foundation of deep insecurity and perpetual victimhood. The group chat plans a potluck, which is their first time actually seeing each other in person in many years. And Allison, for some fucking reason, offers to host. One of the women in the chat, Nama, shows up 9 months pregnant with her toddler in tow, a toddler that Allison didn't even know that she had, so she has to corral this giant dangerous bird into a bedroom. Through the dinner, everyone is offering their own personal life updates, and Allison realizes that all she has going on for months is her obsession with Neil, which she at least knows at this point that she can't bring up. It does mean, though, that she just sits there getting more and more miserable and angry. And then the toddler wanders into the bedroom with the raven, and everyone starts freaking out, but Allison is like, no, look, he's fine. He's a good boy. And in trying to prove it, she offers him a piece of meat, and he tries to grab it and slices through her finger, and she has to spend the night alone in the emergency room. When she gets home, she sees a huge stain on her couch where Nama was sitting, and it won't come out no matter how hard she tries. And the worst thing that could happen happens, and you know it's going to. It once again transitions into the group chat, where Allison publicly, and not even gently at all, tells Nama that she left a giant, what she calls coochie stain on the couch. Nama is like, oh my god, I'm so sorry. I have been using primrose oil to induce labor. I noticed that it soaked through my pants, but I hoped that it hadn't made it to the couch. So sorry about that. Pretty diplomatic response. There's definitely something to say about, like, maybe try a little harder not to stain people's couches if you are deliberately filling yourself with oil, but also, you know, hindsight is 20/20. Allison is in the right to a degree to be a little bit upset about this. It's also, of course, so many compounding things. This isn't just the oil stain speaking. She does, of course, what she always does, which is take it too far in reacting to that righteous upset. She is texting in very short, clipped sentences here, and she just flat out says, steam cleaning will be $100. The other women all come to Nama's defense. They're like, that's nonsense. She has a baby on the way. Can't you just flip the cushion over? And Allison's like, no, I can't flip the cushion over because the cushion has already been flipped and this is the flipped side. The blow up that you have been waiting for starts here, and it just keeps going. The first hint of conflict, and Allison now has a place to let out all of her feelings and just freak the fuck out and dig herself deeper and deeper into a hole that she will not be able to crawl out of. Her and Nama go back and forth. You endangered my kid. Well, you just brought your child with no heads up, and then your kid is the one that opened the door anyway. Which, like, again, she is right, but girl, there are levels to being right. They're going at it. Then one of the women in the group chat who says things like, he's a V big boy with an I, and uses like little custom emoticons that she definitely like Googles and then copy pastes. She's like, guys, can we please just have good vibes only in here? This is a safe space for me, and it's really bad for my mental health to be in the presence of literally any degree of conflict. Nobody takes Allison's side because, one, she is being insane, and also because she has always been the odd one out with these women, and no one was ever going to take her side. She hasn't put in the required effort needed for the odd one out to be part of the in-group. So instead, she lets all of her feelings be heard and known by ranting viciously at everyone, interrupted only by them confirming her suspicions about like having a second group chat and thinking of her as old and bitter. One of them even says, we get it, you use punctuation in your texts because you don't want to risk sounding stupid, even though it makes you seem like you're Amish. Allison is like, none of you have real problems, you're all just here to be validated. And Nama is like, we don't have real problems, your one and only issue is that your friend called it off after you hooked up once. I'm a mother supporting my family on a single wage. And Allison is like, girl, you literally just went to Mexico with your husband. But her issue is less the misrepresentation of Nama's money situation and more that previously mentioned bitterness about someone else being in a relationship and flaunting it. Then Allison flips to all caps and she goes, you're all attacking me, because that's how she always feels in every situation. And everyone leaves the chat. She is then almost immediately invited to Neil's wedding reception. Not the ceremony, just the reception. You know Neil, the guy who wasn't ready for a relationship? Yeah, he's getting married. Isn't that always how it goes? Allison shows up way too early. She watches the ceremony from afar, and then at the reception, she tries to pull him aside to talk with him as a last chance to air out her grievances. But this confrontation is very different than the disembodied voices attacking her from her cell phone, and anything that she planned to say in the months and months of stewing flies out the window. Whatever she is able to awkwardly confront him with, he's like, oh, is that how that happened? I'm so sorry. I don't remember it like that. Like, let's let bygones be bygones. It's my wedding day. Let's just dance. He has not been thinking about this in the way that she has. He tries to get away, so she hits him with her last-ditch effort, that photo that he took of her. He's like, what photo are you talking about? So she pulls it up. At his wedding, off to the side from the dance floor, she pulls up on her phone the photo of her sucking him off. He immediately grabs her phone and deletes it. He's so shocked. He's like, why the fuck do you still have that? I deleted that instantly. That was a one-use item. You either need to come dance with me or you need to leave. So she gets as drunk as she can and she leaves. And when she wakes up the next morning to her front door wide open and the Raven nowhere in sight, she realizes that she is now totally indifferent and numb to all of those feelings that took over her life. And that bleak note is where the second story in Rejection ends. All of the interpersonal conflicts in this one felt so real that it made me genuinely uncomfortable. I read the conversation where Allison is confronting Nama about the stain on the couch too close to bedtime, and my discomfort almost beat out my sleeping medication. Everything about the way that she's always twisting situations so that she can feel like the victim, but then still doing that when she is the victim and going from being wronged to being in the wrong, it feels so true to the experience of being an emotionally unregulated teenager and watching it in a 30-year-old woman who has an extraordinary ability to reflect on others' patterns and behaviors, but no self-awareness of her own, was a truly awful experience. And what made this story as brutal as it was is how well written and thoughtful it is. This is 50 or so pages where you're inside a woman's head as she just goes through these repetitive cycles of obsession and jealousy and self-loathing and self-victimization, always ending up at huge, out-of-proportion conclusions. And yet it never gets boring. Every sentence is a new nugget of insight or wisdom into very human experiences. It is very good at making you feel things by recognizing situations in the little details, even if at face value these situations don't resemble anything you've ever experienced. Allison is so hateable and frustrating, but she's also pitiable. You know that she has positive qualities buried somewhere in there, that she doesn't have to be the way she is, and she's capable of, but not at the moment willing to change. It's impossible to lose interest in her at any point because of how deep into her brain and her thought processes we get, and because we can see so much more about her than she can see in herself. You're spending the whole time watching her re-enter these patterns and treat people like shit and feel hurt by everything, while always very clearly and deliberately internally justifying all of her actions to herself. You also can't look away from Allison because you can feel the inevitable big explosion coming, the clock ticking, or maybe the bomb timer ticking. It's constant, and it's like builds a pressure in your head almost. The characters are all as well thought out and well developed as the first story. Even here with so many more players, it's very clear that Tula Tamudi has a strong concept for each and every person in this story, but he manages to hold back from giving you too much and muddling the waters with unnecessary details. Though I know that he could. I can feel that he knows, for example, the group chat, inside and out, that he has a very clear idea of its dynamics and its history, and because he knows it so well and is such a good writer of the short story, he knows exactly how to convey it all to you in as few sentences as possible. When you take a step back and look at what is being accomplished in each story in this collection, it is genuinely impressive how much of a handle the author has on this form. And I also love that he has filled me with both excitement and dread to continue reading. I am terrified, and I also know that I'm going to love whatever comes next. These two stories alone have solidified this book as a 5-star read, and even though I have like 2/3 of the book left, I think it'll be difficult for anything to lower that rating. I feel very comfortable in placing a lot of trust in this collection and in this author, and I also feel deeply uncomfortable about everything else going on. This book has unnerved me like no horror, no gore, nothing that was made in a factory to make me uncomfortable and make me feel weird has ever done. This is beyond anything. I'm loving it. I'm going to finish the 3rd story and then I'll come update you about it. I'll see you then. So story 3. What a journey this one takes you on. Real rejection heads know that I am not going to be able to get into as much detail of the play-by-play of this story as I have the last 2. I think there are very few social media platforms that would allow me to do that. So I'm going to try and convey the vibes to you in this summary, which do take you for a ride in the same way the actual details do, but know that you are missing a lot. Okay, story 3. It starts with talking about how it took the main character, Kant, a year to write the 1-paragraph-long mass email and 3 weeks to put together the list of recipients, all of his friends, family, and acquaintances. At age 31, this is how he finally came out as gay. You read that and your heart sinks. After these last 2 stories with the varying degrees of despicable narrators united in their shame and self-loathing and social struggles surrounding rejection, you know the relative pattern that this story is going to follow. It's a different and new take on what we've already seen, but this time it's centered in the internal shame and repression of being gay. That's a lot more sad than the inceldom or the femceldom of the prior 2 stories. I feel like these stories are so perfectly ordered to make you feel the most intensely. It goes from frightening and sickening, but also kind of dryly humorous, to like genuinely devastating. Just in the first introduction paragraph of this story, because of the precedent that's been set by the first 2. It rules. It's so good. So after years of knowing and thinking about it, Kant is finally coming out, but he's still really struggling with and held back by the shame surrounding the sadism and degradation that he's into sexually, something that is intricately tied with his experience of being violently bullied growing up, and that he can't unlink from his sexuality, which is also in other ways related to the bullying that was mostly centered around him being the one of, if not the only, Asian kid at his school and the societally imposed femininity of that. He also feels very out of place and excluded from the gay community, not really because of his late coming out or his lack of sexual experience, though those things do play a huge role, especially the latter, but more because of how exclusionary the gay men he knows can be with their fat phobia and their anti-Asian racism. The first time this deeply, deeply repressed, repentant man can bring himself out of his self-hatred for being the way he is and finally go meet up with someone, it's another new and inexperienced man who wants to be slapped on the ass. He needs to coach the awkward and anxious Kant every step of the way of their sexual encounter, and Kant ends up accidentally full-on slapping this guy right on the ballsack, and he starts screaming in pain, and Kant runs out of his apartment. And that is the mortifying end to his life's first ever sexual experience with another person. Kant is more self-hating than any other character in this book by far. He is maybe the most self-hating character I have ever read about. And while, like, yes, sure, he has some pretty intense kinks, there really is no reason for him to feel this way about himself to the degree that he does. And it makes me so sad to see all of this anger and shame that is rooted in the way that he's been treated and bullied throughout his life turned in towards himself. And then he's also kind of like clueless and maladjusted because of it, and he tries things and he doesn't know what he's doing, and it's so brutally relatable. So like, Kant decides that something needs to change, and that thing, first of all, should be his body. So he goes to the gym, and he has no idea what he's doing at all. He shows up in an old pair of swim trunks because he has no workout clothes. He doesn't know how to work any of the machines, and he's so embarrassed at how out of place he must be acting and looking, and how everyone must be perceiving him, that he just about turns around and leaves, but then he thinks that itself is more embarrassing. He messes something up with a machine or the weights, something loud and obvious, and this hot dude tries to help him out. But he is so unused to this kindness from strangers, he's certain that he's being mocked. So he retreats to the bathroom, where the guy follows and pisses with a strong, healthy stream beside him, and then while standing beside him, he gets, like at the urinal, Kant gets a message on Grindr from this guy. This is Julian. Kant looks up at him and he winks and leaves, and then Kant manages to push away his sideness and get some courage to go talk to Julian, and the two of them set up a date. They get on great, they end up back at Julian's place to do the dirty, and Julian bottoms, but then he taps out because he's got a hemorrhoid thing going on, and there's a little bit of blood, and Kant is mortified that he has hurt Julian, and then mortified at being kind of turned on by hurting him. They start a relationship, and they get 6 months into it without ever attempting sex again, or even talking about it. Kant feels like it's way too much to ask to be loved how he is without also adding on this intense sex stuff that he has. He is certain that he has to do everything he can to hide what he calls his hideous desires, and that includes uncommunicated abstinence. Abstinence that he knows will end up tearing this relationship apart. So he tries to be the best boyfriend he can in other ways, like cooking and cleaning and letting the both covert and overt racist comments from Julian's friends slide right off his back. Kant one day finds text messages from Julian's very conventionally attractive ex, who is still a core part of his friend group. This ex, Noah, is asking about the never nude boy and saying he should try putting his dick in rice to get it working again. And Julian's like, oh my god, no, he didn't mean it like that. Like, he wasn't even trying to be racist. Like, it was just a joke. It was in bad taste, but like, that's not what he meant at all. But he can't justify or excuse the obvious fact that he's been talking about their sex life with his friends and with his ex, to be fully clear. This opens up the conversation about what's going on with their dead but also never really alive in the first place bedroom. Julian approaches it already pretty certain that Kant's fear and anxiety and tendency to shut down at any indication that Julian wants to have sex is because of a mixture of inexperience and shame around fetish. But his open willingness to earnestly try and act out what it is Kant desires and hear him out and meet him somewhere in the middle ruins it. It makes it all wrong. It's so opposite from Kant's fantasies, which are centered in the degradation of his partner. It's really interesting how Tula manages to twist this conversation, because at face value, Julian is doing kind of everything right. He's doing his best to give Kant what he needs, but his gentleness and kindness and openness to try things that he isn't really into are wrong for Kant. He's doing it wrong. And even as the reader, you start to get frustrated with him as they try to choreograph this attempt at sex. Julian being so willing and the tone he takes on feels like pity or like condescension. It's a kindness that goes so far as to become formal and impersonal. But then at the same time, what else is he meant to do? Read Kant's mind? Though this isn't in first person, we are inside it. And like Kant, you as the reader start thinking, why can't Julian just have an innate knowledge of how to do this right? Like, come on, man. Kant is doing his best to engage with Julian and slowly dip his toes in the water of disclosure, but he's awkward and he's uncomfortable and he doesn't know how to articulate what he wants. So for a long time, it's a lot of like Come on, honey, I won't judge you. Let's just give it a shot. Kant does try. And as it goes on, his requests get more and more specific to a point where it's almost funny, but the intensity of the awkwardness of the situation holds you back from getting any real enjoyment out of it. Kant is bearing what we'll soon learn is really just the surface of his deepest, darkest, most secret desires because Julian wants him to. He's doing it for the sake of his partner, but it's all contextless. It's lacking in any deeper conversation or acknowledgement of the root of what makes these actions Kant is requesting erotic for him. So he's putting all of these impossible to talk about shameful things out in the open, and he's getting nothing from it. He feels absolutely no arousal while experiencing all of his greatly feared humiliation. And then after it all, after Kant has asked Julian to make specific faces and act like Kant's penis is disgusting and rotting and like Julian has been put in a jar and is being pickled in cum, after all that, Kant thanks Julian for being patient and kind and leaves. And they never see each other again. A couple months pass, and Kant is essentially back in the closet again. He's trying to figure out a way to get his rocks off without being the one degraded by having to admit what he wants. And he finds his way to the custom order porn video online scene. He can get what he wants here while maintaining his social isolation and without being physically perceived. So he starts writing out a script to an amateur video maker, Cody, and the story transitions from the narrative of Kant's life into his script of his perfect, ideal porn video fantasy, and it stays that way for the next 20 pages. You see Cody's posting, and you get the sense from his site that this is a very small-scale, homebrew, low-budget, one-man show type of thing. And what Kant is asking for begins as solidly illogical, with setting the video in a gym rather than like the living room that would be way more likely to be available to this guy. There is a fee that Cody has for filming on location, but he's obviously greatly misunderstood the scope of Cody's service. But then as it goes on, it very quickly becomes clear that more than anything, this is an outlet for him. It starts with Kant writing Cody as playing the role of Julian, and very soon it turns into the most insanely specific, physically impossible in every way BDSM degradation kink scene that just goes on and on. 20 pages. He's started typing and he does not stop. He ends up needing to move over to email because he's hit the limit of the form on Cody's website. He's writing about himself as this at first 7 foot tall, but then as it goes on, taller and taller, massive, buff, sexy man with a 3 foot long penis that tears Cody as Julian in half and then glues him back together with his semen so that he can live out his days as Kant's cum pig. I really hope that my lovely in-laws are not watching this video. Or my own mother. I really can't describe the next 20 pages to you. I don't have the adjectives. I don't have the life experience. It's a very extreme porn that he is writing page after page of. Like I said, it is obviously functioning as more of an outlet for him, but then there are still these parenthetical moments that show that he's writing this with the express purpose of having someone create it. And I can't explain to you how ridiculous that idea gets. Like, in the end, his penis has become so large that it has changed the atmosphere of planet Earth and has solved global warming, and he wants that to be communicated in this amateur porn film. But he's like interjecting with little bits of advice about the logistics of creating this film, like a recipe that he's workshopped for realistic looking semen, as if this is possible even by like blockbuster, big budget movie standards. So he isn't just letting himself indulge, he is holding on to the delusion that this will happen. And I think that is the most unsettling part of it all, the most unhinged, far beyond his desires, which, like I've said, sure, yes, they are a bit weird. To the average person, they're very extreme and specific and out there, and also certainly blown out of proportion by the amount of porn that he's watched because his lifetime of repression hasn't afforded him any other way of releasing his sexual desires. It is weird as hell. But is it actually shameful? Is this all-consuming shame that has been in the driver's seat for his entire life really necessary? It isn't, right? And the book is kind of telling you it isn't. Though it reflects how funny extreme fetish can be, it is never coming across with a tone of ridicule. Kant isn't really a spectacle because of what he wants. He is because he wants it so bad that he, as an otherwise pretty reasonable person, is living off of pure delusion. It's 20 full pages of this raunchy, beyond the pale, pure, insane sex and cum and degradation and sadism and gargantuan genitalia and very specific and very personal kinks, all of which can absolutely be psychoanalyzed and explored and connected to the character and his past, and you become a little desensitized to it. You see more of the humor in it. Like, one of the directions that he writes to Cody in here, he says, "In an effort to remember your life before becoming my designated fuck socket, you try to draw a picture of your former self, but then, sniffing the tip of your pen, you realize the ink is actually my cum." Which is awesome. Like, that's so funny and ridiculous and silly. And it's written with such sincerity, a sincerity that is almost nice to see from Kant, who really shamelessly gets into writing this, something that we have never seen him as being capable of. He has stayed up all night writing this. He's been swept away into it, and you have been too. You've been lulled into this sense of security reading this story where you're like, okay, like, my man has managed to get himself some release. This was probably actually like pretty healthy for him. And then for one final page, after the script ends, it switches back to the original narrative. It says, "The total, after tax and tip, goes north of $8,000, comprising half his savings, an extravagance that eases his guilt about the complexity of his request. If the video is well executed, Kant could see it retaining its appeal for perhaps a year, and if he budgets carefully or gets a raise, he could afford to do it every year. Proceeding this way, life will not be ideal, but probably sustainable, and it's not like there's an alternative. He only needs to make it through one life." You read that and you think, okay, that's the final gut punch. It's a very fitting way for this story to end. It's pretty in line with the first two, bleak and human and devastating. He only needs to make it through one life absolutely destroys me. I could almost cry just thinking about it, which is kind of funny in the context of the story that we're talking about. Like, it's about a dude's hardcore custom porn tape, but like, that isn't what it's about, right? That's the whole appeal of this collection to me. We're talking about so much more than that. It's a look at the impact of this specific intersection of race and sexuality that Kant inhabits, and how the pain and violence inflicted on him because of it has created this person who feels totally unable to connect with others or be loved or seen or known. That isn't quite the end of the story, though. Kant sits back, exhausted, shaking from the exertion of this, and he goes to send the email to Cody. But he's too tired to see that his hand has slipped a little, and he hasn't sent the email to Cody. His shaking hands have pressed tab, and the CO has autofilled to the coming out email list. I know this sounds dramatic, but I genuinely felt my heart stop in a way that I have never experienced before in my entire life. I almost needed to go scream into a pillow after I read that. This is so far past worst case scenario for Kant that I literally malfunctioned. Hand flew over my mouth. I can say that he doesn't need this irrevocable shame to rule his life all I want, but that doesn't mean that the shame isn't there. And we've gone from this pretty humorous, silly release of the shame and repression and a first ever experience of freedom for him to the worst thing that could possibly ever happen. And you're so wrapped up in the sex fantasy world that the real world that Kant lives in has basically ceased to exist for you. And then all of a sudden, it's shooting you in the face and ending the story. Absolutely perfectly done. This final moment has been perfectly curated to shock you as intensely as possible, and it does. Again, this is an unforgettable story, maybe even more so than the first one, though I do think that one is unbeatable in the skill that it displays. Every once in a while, I am still thinking, in my mind, I'm just going, he sent it to his coming out list. And I have to remind myself how to breathe again. I love how this one started out very sad and pitiful and then transitioned into this at first strange, but then really honestly funny and kind of fun while still having the evident dark roots, fantastically, overtly, excessively sexual story to then right when you think you know what's going on, it pulls the rug out from underneath of you and you are sick. And you're just left to imagine the new kinds of shame and humiliation that he's going to have to discover during the rest of his life. I will say this story can drag a little bit because the porn screenplay is so remarkably long, but that is important and it's very much on purpose. And I don't know if there's anything in here that could have been removed without compromising the way this story wraps up. It just feels a little bit less tight than the first two, but it has an incredible payoff that makes it all very much worth it. I thought this had a really interesting and unique exploration of how Kant's experience of race and the feminization of Asian men and the way fat bodies are treated among gay men impacted his shame around his sexuality and his personal fetishes. It was a very significant aspect of his psyche that the story explored without really obviously shoving in your face that, like, this is why he likes this specific thing. This story was boundary pushing, it was dizzying, it was hilarious and empathetic and sickening and visceral and vivid and strange, but then also familiar. It's another great example of how Tula Tamudi can take relatable human emotions and then blow these situations up into totally unique, absurd stories that, even if the facts of them don't reflect anything you've ever experienced, you can still connect with them and feel a part of the world that they're creating. I thought that this was exceptional. I really believe that there is nothing like this story out there, and I loved it. I'm going to go read story 4, and then I'll get back to you to talk about it. I'll see you then. All right, story 4. It's a little bit of the reprieve that we all needed, and me saying that is going to sound confusing until we get to the end. This story is the first-person perspective that we've gotten so far in this collection, and that is because it is written as essentially an Am I the Asshole post. But actually, it's even worse than that, because it's a business bro posting his entire life story in a business bro forum looking for romantic advice. He is the most insufferable, absolutely irritating dude you have ever read about. This is a nightmare scenario. He's an entrepreneur. Need I say more? Posting on Reddit. Need I say more? He actually does have a really unique voice, and I say that with great disdain. He was homeschooled, but he needs all of his readers to know that he's not the stereotypical homeschooled kid, because he made a very active effort studying social cues and culture, and more obvious than anything else, slang. It is hard to describe how much and how ridiculously he overuses slang. Like, this is a difficult, cringy read, and he's using slang from like the past 100 years. Let me give you an example of this, okay? I stan you. I'm your simp. I freaks with you heavy, and that is no cap whatsoever. Oh my god. He's really trying to convince the reader that he's cool, which works very well with the Reddit format. Of course, he is both creating a narrative and also trying to position himself in a certain way so that he's seen in a specific light. That is every Reddit post. But this is a much worse reading experience than your average Reddit post, which is saying a lot. This guy, Max, yes, short for Maximilian, he's telling the story of meeting Allison. You remember Allison, it's that same Allison. He met her in the wake of her losing all of her friends and still trying to get over Neil and his marriage when she was in that empty, numb state, like truly rock bottom. Max is kind of just going through the story of their relationship with very little indication as to the topic of this post or what specifically he's asking advice about. When it comes to romance, he is unsurprisingly totally clueless, almost maliciously clueless about how to approach anything, but he's doing it with absolutely unshakable confidence. He thinks he's doing it all right, and he is the most smooth guy you have ever seen. As we know from Allison's chapter, she doesn't really have anything else to hold on to in her life. She doesn't have anything to ground her or any other connection that would give her a reason to not let this man literally physically pull her onto his lap in the restaurant and whisper in her ear during their first date. And then on their second date, which of course he pushed her to go on, and she kind of indifferently accepted with the air of someone not really present enough in their own life to know that they could make another choice. What does he do on that second date but surprise her with a trip to Barcelona in 3 hours? Second date. She does actually try to say no to this, but he pushes, and she loses her job because she goes with him, and she ends up needing to move in with him. An offer that she does not want to accept. She does know on some level that this dude is fucking awful. She clearly doesn't like him, but she's really out of choices. And he is so persistent, he breaks her down, despite how abundantly clear she makes her reluctance. A really important thing to know about Max is that he is goal-oriented, something that he speaks about almost like it's a religious delusion. So he is upset and disappointed at Allison for moving into his apartment on his demand and then not being being as extraordinarily motivated to do things like create savory meal replacement shakes, like what he does. Instead, she's really depressed. She's sitting around the apartment all day with no money and no food because all he has in the house, all he consumes are his disgusting clam chowder flavored protein shakes, and he won't give her anything to support herself despite his abundance of money. It's super scary knowing about her history, about the place that she's currently at in her life and her eating disorder especially. Though she isn't locked into the apartment, he on some level has found a vulnerable woman, orchestrated a situation where she relies only on him without doing anything to meet her basic needs, and is essentially holding her captive. All the while telling the story like, guys, to keep it 100 with you, I was giving her the most amazeballs deal ever, and she wasn't hustling like I do. She's just lying around the hizzy all day. Oh my god. He decides that all the time she spends on her phone must be the issue, and he frames it as wanting to be her accountability homie to get her back on track and being her best goal-oriented self. So he takes her phone and he looks at her search history and he's like, why is she looking at so many videos of grain silo deaths? And then he secretly installs a beta version of a productivity app that he's developing that basically bricks her phone, but it's so very sinister and sneaky. It makes it so she can't send or receive text messages, but it looks like her messages are still going through, and anything he doesn't want her to look at just endlessly loads. This includes porn. He refers to sex exclusively as Netflix and chilling, and he's like, her looking at porn is so ungrateful. I know we haven't done anything together since Barcelona, but that's because it distracts me from my work. And also, I only take 2 minutes and she takes 20, and that's just not fair. There's so much hypocrisy and manipulation that no matter how hard he tries to twist it, he literally cannot make himself appear favorable in any way. Multiple times he justifies his actions because his teletherapist is a black woman. Let me read this to you. Mind you, I'd been keeping my teletherapist looped in on everything. I told her I'd met a girl who'd moved in with me, whom I was supporting so she could pursue her goals, and my teletherapist confirmed that was great of me to do, that it's good I'm embracing my role as Allison's main attachment figure. And I said, bars, that's very tea, sis. That's exactly what I am. I'm her main attachment figure, and I'm embracing it. Go off, slay queen. Brackets, my teletherapist is black. Oh no, oh no. Oh no, white baby, you can't be talking like that. This has gotta be the most hard to read paragraph of the entire book, but every other part is just about as difficult as this. Like, it is honestly almost too much. My stomach is twisting. Like, I can't look. He's continuing to frame this as all being for her own good and not him forcing isolation onto her until she breaks, which she does. Of course she does. She is stuck in this house for months with no food, no money, no way of connecting to the outside world, and she becomes singularly obsessed with wiping down the TV console. Like 10 hours a day she's wiping and wiping. He knows this because he has a security camera in his house and he watches her on his third monitor while he's at work. Guy with the third monitor. He's like, guys, I wasn't spying on her though. I set up the camera before she moved in with me. I'm just checking on her. But he is like, this is kind of weird that she's wiping the TV console for 10 hours a day. Maybe there's just like a really stubborn stain on there though. He finally asks her what's going on by being like, this doesn't seem like it's contributing towards you meeting your goals. And she moves on to sitting all day every day staring blankly at the wall. And whenever he tries to ask her about this, she looks right through him and says she's meditating. This makes him decide that she is talking to another guy in her mind and they're making fun of him together, which pisses him off. It's truly unbelievable. He gets mad at her and they fight about her not being goal-oriented and motivated, though it's really kicked off by this imagined transgression. And she's like, you want me to be like you, but your goals are just to reinvent stupid shit and scam people into buying it, which, by the way, he does censor her curse words when relaying this conversation. He hears this, and he decides to admit to her what his true, real goals are, something he wasn't planning on telling her or any woman that he would ever see until at least a year into the relationship. He wants to have 12 children as soon and as quickly as possible, and he wants them to each have 12 children until after 9 short generations they have 5 billion offspring. He doesn't say it directly, but yes, inbreeding is the goal here. His idea is that all of these generations will never leave the family compound because they'll prohibit the acquisition of any and all existing languages and force social and financial dependence. all so that they can create basically their own planet-sized society of people all striving toward a common goal. Allison, though obviously very mentally unwell and seemingly perhaps in psychosis, someone who we have been watching disintegrate through Max's eyes in a really scary way, even she is like, yeah, this is too much for me, I'm out. And she leaves. Max finally turns back to face the audience and say that he's bothered by the lack of return on investment in this situation, and he wants to know if they see any weak points or inefficiencies where he could improve next time. He's all for equal rights, of course, and he makes that clear. But he's learned that some women can't handle a passionate guy, and they will use their tears as manipulation, and he wants to know how to work around that next time so that he can get a greater ROI. Thus begins, after this, a Reddit classic, the edits. He starts with trying to clear things up and justify himself, and also to clap back at commenters who are disagreeing with him. Obviously, at this point, he's pretty ignorant to the knowledge that literally no one is on his side, and he's thinking this is just like a few bad apples who are misunderstanding what he's saying. He's like, I'm not an abuser, I'm not a Nazi, I can't believe you would say that. This was all for her benefit. I'm a helpful guy. My black teletherapist says so. Then he switches tack to, hey guys, you can't get me fired if I'm my own boss, so posting my personal information doesn't really affect me, it's just embarrassing for you. Post photos of me all you want, but 16% of men experience significant hair loss before the age of 30, so joke's on you, I'm within standard deviation of the mean, you burnt. Then he acknowledges that Allison is in the comment section, and he's like, if you guys side with her, you're going against the word of my black teletherapist, and that's basically racism 101. Next edit, he's like, okay, fine. This is my final time addressing this. We could only dream. You have all abused me and shown me that there's no place in the world for a motivated, goal-oriented guy like myself, so I'm ditching you all. I'm going to sea in my ocean pod, and I'm meeting up with my investy besties, and we're creating a floating sovereign nation, and we're flying in baddies from developing countries to help work toward my family goals. The very final update is him being like, okay, I'm under arrest in Thailand for human trafficking. Even though all these women joined us consensually, the whole world is so ungrateful for all the good I've done. I can't believe you stalkers got me arrested. But tell me this. After all the value I've created, and the best-in-class innovations I have successfully brought to market, and the inspiration I have offered by my example, if everything I did was so evil, how is it that up until now, not a single person ever told me no? And that's how the story ends. So while this one is obviously still extremely dark and following a very sinister man who is incapable of ever seeing himself as doing anything wrong, the reason I call it a reprieve is because we finally see some consequences. I mean, he's fully like, guys, the punishment for this could be the death penalty. And he also talks about how Allison has connected to and met up with his exes, and they've bonded over their shared horrific experiences with him, which feels like, all things considered, a pretty positive ending for her too, right? All of that combined with this, certainly a little bit on the nose, but also very funny and silly final line, means that this story, thank God, functions as a bit of a palate cleanser, something that the author knew his readers needed after the hell of experiencing the first 3 stories in this collection. This is definitely a little bit more forgettable than the first 3, though the bar is so incredibly high. I think that's okay though. I think that is needed for me to maintain steam, to keep wanting to read this and not burn out on how truly exhausting these stories can be, despite how good they are. I needed to not finish this one feeling sick to my stomach and deeply uncomfortable, but in doing that, of course, I'm not going to be constantly thinking about this story for the rest of my life, you know? I think this would be good on its own, but it fits very perfectly exactly where it is placed in this collection. It is the weakest, but the weakest here in this collection is still very solid and genuinely good. I found that it relied a little bit too heavily on the overuse of slang to the point where it just absolutely grated. And of course it was meant to, but sometimes I didn't want to feel like I had to put so much effort in to understand what the fuck this guy was trying to say. Though I do think that it served a very interesting purpose in kind of softening him, making him seem cringy and annoying, but hiding how truly dangerous he was. I also thought that it was really unique and interesting to follow this unreliable narrator as he creates his narrative for other people to consume on a forum that inherently produces and promotes one-sided, unreliable narration. I love it when people are lying to others and themselves, and telling it through this format lended itself really well to the constructing of an image of himself that he's trying to express to the world, and that he wants people to buy into. And then, no matter how hard he tries, he fails absolutely so miserably. It was fun and fresh, and also, like, familiar if you've ever read literally any Am I the Asshole type of story online, and I really enjoyed it. And I'm glad to have something a little bit lighter. Though, I mean, it still wasn't light. Oh my god, it ends with him in jail for human fucking trafficking, but at least he is being punished. You know, it's kind of like sapping the abolitionist out of me a little bit. I'm going to go read the next story. I'm like partway through it right now, and then I'll get back to you probably tomorrow. I'll see you then. Bye. All right, I have finished the book, and while I think that the last third is weaker than the first bit, this is still a very solid 5 stars for me, and one of my favorite and most unforgettable reads of 2025. So the 5th story in here, main character, is going to be a little bit hard to describe, partly because it was a little bit hard to completely comprehend and to follow. It's way less of a linear narrative, though none of them are exactly that. I think more than that, I might struggle to explain this to you because Tula Tamudi really just says everything very, very well. And it's a lot of insights and observations that he has communicated perfectly and that I can't really rephrase for you or add anything onto. So we're just going to do our best. Like the story before it, this one plays with its format a little bit. It begins with an introduction that lets us know that this is a compiling of information and context. A master doc, if you will. It's about a hoax perpetrated online by someone named B, who we know from previous stories is Kant's younger sibling. This introduction is written with all of the authority and big-headedness and power complex that you might expect from a Google Doc creator writing about, at the end of the day, meaningless online drama. Also, I love that you're thrown into this with no context at all, and it's very much written with the assumption that everyone opening it would of course be privy to the topic. It's so real to the experience of scrolling through social media that it's almost a bit jarring. So after this introduction, the next part is called The Post. It's this kind of confession that kicked everything off, and it's written from B's perspective in first person. In both this story and the last one, Tula Tamudi is not tied to his format, so you don't really feel the limitations of this being like a post on the internet. He's telling a story first and foremost, which I think is the right choice, but if you take a step back, it's hard not to notice that this isn't written super realistically to fit the format. It gets into a lot of B's life story, all of it important, but not all of it necessarily something that would be written in a real life version of this scenario. So B refers to himself as the most ubiquitous person on the internet, and also completely and totally unknown by everyone. But anyone who's even a modicum of online will have interacted with B, as they claim, at one point, but that's all we really know before we get into like the life history here. Like I said, this is Kant's younger sibling. B talks about growing up with this hyper-feminine mom who was always trying to push her gender expectations onto her child, and B always rejected them. When they were young, they sold their gender to a classmate, inspired by, I think, a Simpsons episode where Bart sells his soul. From a young age, B rejected anything embodying any and all socially imposed identity, which is like all identity. B is by far the most reflective, intelligent, and insightful narrator in this story, and most of what they talk about is identity and their defiant discomfort with it. Specifically, race and gender are what impact B the most, and what they don't want to be defined by or forced into the categories of, but to a pretty extreme degree. B spends most of their life fighting against everything that comes with having a body that is gendered and racialized against their consent. They get to university a very unique, stubborn, steadfast, confrontational person, and in their very first meeting with the people also living in this co-op at Stanford, the introduction circle meeting where they're going around and saying their name and where they're from, B refuses any pronouns or gender identity. One of the guys who's also living in the house, Craig, pushes. He's like, okay, so you're non-binary, you're agender, you're gender non-conforming, and B is like, no, no, and no. I'm none of those things, and I'd prefer if you didn't call me them. I am nothing. Everyone is confused and almost offended at B's refusal to elaborate or walk them through it, but they're expressing it with the social justice language of the well-read and not well-practiced. Craig says, as a majority cis-white group, we just want to know how to refer to you while minimizing harm. And B says, why don't you try my name? Someone else butts in to speak for B and says, what I think B might be saying is we all agree that categories are all valid and useful, but we just differ on who gets to speak for whom. Am I close? Not really, I said. She asked if I could elaborate, and I said no. That made me laugh out loud. B is being difficult on purpose because that is who B is, but you're also pretty convinced on how irritating everyone else in this conversation is too. It ends up being just about a screaming match with no one siding with B once the conversation turns to B's refusal to accept Asian as an identifier or label. B thinks it's a nonsense lumping together of people with totally disparate experiences, and any shared experiences aren't identity defining in the way the label suggests and the use of it suggests. Whereas the other side, being everyone else, is talking about the importance of solidarity and self-definition without acknowledging that that same self-definition is what they're denying B, because B's self-definition doesn't fit into their limited expectations of how someone should build their identity. It's a whole bunch of people misunderstanding each other, mostly people misunderstanding B, but B is not immune to being wrong or frustrating or antisocial in this conversation. Though, despite that, it is hard not to take the side of this person who everyone is upset at, largely because they are doing things differently and to others incomprehensibly. This conversation goes on, and it doesn't really end with any resolution. The Asian woman who she's mostly arguing against gets to pull the refugee family card when it really isn't all that relevant to the argument. She's also very attractive and articulate, so of course no one would ever go against her beliefs, especially because her beliefs align with a standard worldview. Writing in hindsight, B is willing to accept some of the parts of this conversation that they messed up and could have handled better, now older, are able to articulate what was impossible to articulate then. Finally, the group moves on to room assignments, and over again, B just says, "I want a single." They're like, well, there are only really a couple singles, and they're usually reserved for the older students, and B just says, "I want a single," to any and everything, like a petulant child who is also very aware that they've started off on the wrong foot and would never be able to win back the favor of any possible roommate in this group. This strong-willed defiance becomes social isolation and depression. B tucks away into the single that they do end up getting and spends every waking hour wrapped up in the internet. At this stage, there's a lot of watching real life gore and horror live leak stuff, really comforted by the way these videos strip away humanity's facade of civility. The only friend B makes, weirdly enough, is Craig, who does his best to understand B, though his best is not very good, and B can see right through his apology to the attempt at alleviating his guilt and rebuilding his idea of himself as this well-meaning, educated warrior for social justice and women's rights. Do you recognize that? Do you know who that is? It's the fucking feminist. I had a feeling that B was the QPOC friend, which I can't remember if I brought up when I talked about the feminist chapter, that first chapter. I can't remember if B made it into my summary, but B is the friend that he repeatedly calls my QPOC friend. And I had a feeling that that was who B was when we started this, but I did not catch on that the feminist was Craig until it's outright said. Looking back, it is so obvious, but I also think it's interesting that from a different perspective, although we see all of his flawed thinking very clearly through B, he comes across as more intelligent than you might have expected from him when you're in his head, and he's so intensely driven by his desire for romance. You don't realize until you see him here that he actually has the capacity to think about other things and articulate other thoughts. It did make me shriek when it was confirmed who he was. I've said it, I love when the interconnected stories interconnect. After university, B goes through an era that they talk about with pretty deep shame and regret, where they really tried to be what the world wanted them to be, where they accepted the responsibility forced onto them by their unavoidable white lib peers, where they were the educator and the rehabilitator and the exonerator of all the white guilt surrounding them. There's a lot of very astute and insightful observations on the culture of social justice, and also B's own role and own unsavory behaviors that are recognized as being characteristics that they are now criticizing in others. B's typically here living in co-op housing situations and talks a lot about how people politicize and socially condemn bad manners as something greater than what they really are. It's exactly the when you ask your non-binary roommate to do the dishes. Like B's complaining about how asking someone not to play music at night is adopting carceral logic to them, but then also admits to taking part in this call-out culture, like leading everyone in the house into condemning one of the roommates for saying that bisexuals and cishet relationships face less discrimination, or denouncing one of them for queer baiting by posting a photo during Pride with a rainbow painted on her cheek even though she's cishet. Ridiculous. Sorry, I'm not making a statement on either of those discourses. I'm just saying this is objectively meaningless discourse, right? B also picks up the tactics that they've seen others use, like they defend themselves by always bringing up their immigrant father who died by suicide. In this section, B talks about the paradox of the stereotype, how everyone is so against stereotyping, but also wants to be stereotyped in the right way by the right people, by the in-group, to have their personhood issue to them, and how B just doesn't really buy into that. This is the only time in B's life where they are not completely socially isolated, and there is a community that accepts them, but really, at what cost? There's a woman, Zamira, who becomes B's best friend mostly by force. They live in the same co-op and are both Asian, and Zamira just assumes that B is a lesbian like she is. All stuff that we know is not to be a good basis for connection. They have this really intense friendship that again is kind of forced upon B, where Zamira will often push for B to open up about trauma so that she can be an emotional support. And she expects the same from B, who cannot and will not reciprocate that. Especially because Zamira is constantly, as B says, under siege. She's constantly in crisis, forever in some sort of emergency, social, financial, mental, or otherwise, and B is on the hook for all of it. One time, Zamira had needed B to help run a booth at an indie market fair, but B had a doctor's appointment, and Zamira was like, well, what about the coyote knuckle earrings that I made and gave to you that were worth $400? And B's like, well, that's your pricing, and also my ears aren't even pierced. Zamira is always implying that everything she needs from B is because of her past trauma and therefore inarguable and necessary, and B is a bad person if they refuse to do anything less than what Zamira demands. This friendship ends explosively, as it was always going to do, when B finally says no to Zamira, who is trying to pressure them into starting a rent strike in their co-op. And then years later, B sees a call-out post with a photo of Zamira exposing her for being a white girl from Wisconsin named Bethany who faked her race and her extremely traumatic past that involved every type of oppression and negative experience a person could ever have, and played everybody by using it to constantly victimize herself to get what she wanted. What the fuck? Okay, anyway, none of that directly relates to what this confession is about, but it is interesting and it's important context of B's life and why B ended up doing what they did. So their mom started dying of cancer, so they moved back in with her to help take care of her. Despite the complicated relationship they'd had when B was growing up, getting distance from their mom made B realize that the way she would try to force B to live up to these expectations of femininity were just her trying to make her child more easily loved. While B is caretaking, they become more online than they ever have been before. This time it's really with Twitter. Twitter is B's ideal universe. It's a place where being disembodied is powerful. They speak so lovingly of all of Twitter's horrific faults and flaws. B also has all their bills more than paid by creating this fake cam girl, by hiring someone to record 200 hours of footage and then stitching it together. So they become basically a full-time shitposter while they're funded by this fake cam girl. Shitposting is really what they're into. To them, it's the ability to share and kind of connect while being divorced from an identity. So B starts to spread their reach, creating more and more accounts, claiming that the Chrissy Teigen Twitter account was always them and that Chrissy Teigen just went along with it, even though the two of them have never spoken, which is hilarious. And especially hilarious if you were online in like 2012 to 2016. It's organized trolling, but B wants to do it at scale. So they purchase loads and loads of leaked passwords and usernames of Twitter accounts, and they get like 12,000 accounts that have been inactive for over a year and have at least 100 followers. And this begins a serious, complex production where, using algorithms and large language models, B has a web of bot accounts spread across the internet and can pull strings to create drama wherever and however they please. Over time, it grows to something like 6 million accounts under B's control. What they're basically saying is that anyone you've ever interacted with online that had some absolutely insane opinion that you thought no person could ever have wasn't a person. It was B or one of B's bots. They get into detail about one of these major Twitter dramas that honestly could absolutely be real, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was. I won't relay the whole thing to you here. I think you should just go read this story, just read this collection, really, and you'll be able to get a better understanding of the complexity and planning and devotion that B has to this cause. And also you'll be able to better know how perfectly this sounds like some bullshit that would go down on Twitter. It is just so real. B admits to being behind each and every account that was part of this drama. I will tell you that the drama was all kicked off by someone calling out someone else for tweeting about how hot Timothée Chalamet was, saying he's literally a minor, what's wrong with you? And then everyone was like, he was 21 when this tweet was posted, and they were like, well, his features are minor coded. And then it snowballed from there, as meaningless, stupid internet drama is wont to do. But it's that thing I said before of like, there's no way anyone on earth actually thinks that. They don't. It was B. At one point, B like turns towards the camera and says, it was all me, but the discourse that it spawned, that was you, which almost gave me a little fucking shiver. This confession post ends with B admitting that this post is an abstraction of the truth, that there is one true post that was never actually posted. It is the real canonical events, but they used that post to train a large language model to generate millions of different versions of this, where some important details are changed so that no one can ever figure out who B really is. And they're now moving on and they're looking for the next place that they can be no one. It then switches back to the original creator of the Google Doc, who is outlining theories and conspiracies that the Botkin community has made about B's true identity and motives. Some people take B at face value, but the author of the doc points out the problems with this, like how it would take 200 millennia with the current technology to generate the number of different changed posts that B claims to have created, and that all of the thousands of versions of this post found across the internet so far feel more human and narratively competent than anything an AI could create. There's also a theory that the thousands of versions of the post are the outcome of a decentralized, uncoordinated group piece of fan fiction, but no one really understands what the motives behind this would be. There is a theory that connects this work to an author named Tony Tulatamudi, who, if you take the first posted version of the original as truth, which is the one that we read, shares a shocking amount of demographic details with B. They talk about how none of the appearances that Tulatamudi has ever made have been actually totally, unequivocally proven to be him, and if we believe B's post, then we know that hiring actors for the trolling is something that they've done plenty. And then the story ends with the author of the doc reflecting on their many hundreds of hours of research and work put into figuring out who's behind this and if it's even the truth, and getting nowhere. They say that they hope whoever is behind this, despite their aversion to being known, takes some comfort in the sincerity of thousands of people's desire to know them. And that is the end of the final narrative story in Rejection. I thought that B's authorial voice was maybe the most interesting, the least exaggerated, and the easiest to connect to. Though as a short story, I will say this is probably the weakest of the bunch. I still really enjoyed it. I mean, I just love this book. I love the way it's written. There's not much that this could have done to really truly disappoint me. This one is very meta and confusing and hard to really grasp the totality of. Like I've said a million times now, I think you do just need to read it for yourself. I was very compelled by all of B's meditations on identity. You can tell this is something that the author has looked at from every angle and has spent an unbelievable amount of time thinking about, and he's able to communicate his ideas in a way that isn't easy for me to describe, but is very skilled and very clear despite their complexity. Some of the more complicated, muddy, gray stuff is maybe even especially clear. He walks you through it without being condescending. His level of explanation is perfect, and that really comes through in this story specifically. Where B can have a very pretentious, holier-than-thou voice, it never comes across, though, as the author's intention to speak down to you, even though these are, of course, his thoughts he's come up with, not his thoughts necessarily, but thoughts that he's come up with about society and identity. Maybe this sounds really fucking stupid and obvious, but I like to read books that are written by people who are just generally good communicators. I don't know that I can say that about every writer, even some of my favorites, and I think that Tulatamudi's ability to communicate well really comes through in this story. This one does feel like it's bigger than my ability to review it. I thought it was so interesting for every single word, and it left me with a lot to think about, and not in a way that made me feel like shit, so I appreciate that for the last major story of a book that was a horrific reading experience on the whole. After this story, there's one called 16 Metaphors, and it's not a story, it's 16 metaphors. Didn't really care for it, and I didn't really see all that many people reviewing who did care for it. I think a lot of them are trying for the darkly humorous tone, but I'm not convinced that Tulatamudi has the sauce to make that work for one-liners. Like, his ability to be laugh out loud funny comes more from his blunt, dry, witty observations about human behavior. But it's really like 3 pages. Who cares? The very last part of this book, before the acknowledgements, is a fake rejection letter about this book, where the author airs out all of his grievances and anxieties about his own writing and his intentions and how his audience might read into them, about how much he himself may or may not be reflected in each character, and what other people will think about that. I believe that this is the perfect end to this collection. Throughout, it hasn't seemed like Tulatamudi thinks himself or any of us above these characters, even though they are in very exaggerated situations where they act despicably. Very often, there is a certain amount of empathy for their feelings, if not their behaviors. Here, though, this is him really and truly being almost but not quite vulnerable and saying, I can write about these things all I want with some authorial distance, but I am just like you. I am also deeply afraid of rejection, of other people seeing me, of being misunderstood or unwanted or ignorant. But he does still maintain that distance by writing this from the perspective of an imagined publisher. He doesn't quite get to that level of vulnerability that would be the really awkward discomfort we felt reading about his characters. Because, like he's saying here, he is afraid to fully let go and be seen like that. The cruelty with which he writes about his own work here is deliberate. It can be a little bit bordering on excessive, I think, a debasement that can be seen as approval seeking. But again, like, part of what he's saying is, I want your approval. There are some valid critiques in there as well, so it feels pretty balanced. It has you both wanting to defend the work from the imagined, harsh, unfair publisher, and also seeing some of its faults, which, if you loved this as much as I did, is refreshingly eye-opening. Importantly, this rejection letter, while it is about the book, is more about the author, because he's kind of putting himself in the shoes of his characters, and that means that it has to be about his rejection, not his works. It picks apart each story, but with the basis of critiquing his own biases and faults, and again, how much he may or may not be writing from his own experience or secretly relating to the evil people in the stories. It is very much directed toward him as a person and how who he is as a person might be showing up in his stories. And while I am meant to be and am certainly uncomfortable with his level of self-flagellation and these insecurities laid bare, I also appreciated having this little retrospective that goes through the stories one by one, and it pointed out things that I think I wouldn't have noticed on my own, like how each of the characters ends up in different ways and to varying degrees being a writer, or how it views B's project as almost wish fulfillment for an insecure author to have your writings flood the world, yet you remain impossible to be held accountable to their impact. You outnumber your readers, you are heard but not seen, you avoid any scrutiny. I don't think I would have looked at B's story like that, but it totally reframed it for me. All in all, this last piece is the perfect self-aware and reflective closing to a pretty much perfect book. Yeah, I didn't like the 16 metaphors, but it was so quick and inoffensive, it doesn't really bring down the rating for me at all. I will never think about it again or remember it as part of this collection, and it being so incredibly short does not dissuade me from highly recommending this book. It doesn't even make me feel like I need to have a little disclaimer when I recommend it, like, it's so good except this one. I mean, like, I just don't really give a fuck. It was 3 pages. So to wrap things up, I have just, like, sung my praises this entire video. You know what I'm going to say. This book is extraordinarily up my alley. I probably loved it more than the average person would. Like I've said, Tula Tamudi, in my opinion, is a master of the short story. He's just got it. He knows exactly how they work and how to tell his stories through this medium. But it isn't just short stories that he excels at. He is also word to word, sentence to sentence, page to page, a very good writer. Again, with the efficiency in phrasing a sentence to so perfectly deliver information or evoke a description that would take other writers, other very good writers, a paragraph to convey. The writing is so evocative and vivid, with perfect use of simile and exactly the level of descriptive writing that I'm looking for. What stands out the most, of course, is the quality of insights into these characters and the reflection that they have of humanity more generally. Tula Tamudi just knows and understands and can write about people. And he writes about people through stories that are horrific and dark and remarkably uncomfortable, and it makes this collection both impossible to put down and nauseating to think about picking up. It rules. It is just so good. Even if you're not that into short stories, which I can't remember the last time I read a short story collection, though to be fair, I used to be very, very into them. I think you should give this a shot anyway. Maybe read a story every couple of days or something to avoid burning yourself out and to give you time to really sit on these because they deserve your thought and your energy. While I may have just spoiled it all for you, I really can't emphasize how unique of a read this is, and I want you to all at least once experience Tula Tamudi's writing for yourself because it really is like out of this fucking world. This is starting to sound sponsored. It's not. I just wholeheartedly love and stand behind this book. Also, he doesn't need my endorsement. I think this was nominated for the Booker, wasn't it? Anyway, I think this video is going to be posted close to Christmas, so Merry Christmas to all who celebrate. Maybe this year you should consider getting yourself a little gift. Maybe that gift could be access to the Frankie Shelf Book Club. It's like $3 American a month, $5 Canadian, and if it's more than that, it's because you're buying it on the iOS app. iOS is stealing money from you. Go onto your browser and get it there, okay? In January, we're reading Tar Baby by Toni Morrison, and then we're reading Creep by Emma Van Straten in February, and then The Coin by Yasmin Zaher in March. We also do other things. We did a fucking Secret Santa this Christmas. Over 100 people participated. Is that not the cutest thing you've ever heard in your life? We do monthly craft nights. Recently, we did a Jackbox game night, all thanks to Isa. Everybody say thank you, Isa. We send each other mail and shit. I don't know. It's just like a really cool, lovely community that I am, not to be sappy, but I'm really grateful to be a part of. So if you're cool, you should come join us. Anyway, happy holidays. Maybe buy yourself a little gift, or maybe go get yourself like a cookie or something. That could maybe be worth your money a little bit more, but consider it, okay? Happy holidays. I'll see you in the new year. Mwah.